Even though it's only a third of the way complete, Emberheart Games' Wizordum is required playing for not just Hexen fans, but for anyone who has ever looked up from messing around with an in-game level editor only to realize it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you've been working on diegetic enemy placement for 6 hours. As yet another movement shooter from Apogee in the vein of Duke 3D, Wizordum stands out by pulling the same trick Hexen did when it branched off the Doom engine in 1995, setting itself apart with unique enemies, an elaborate fantasy setting, and magical spells instead of assault rifles. It worked then, and it works here too. Currently, Wizordum is in early access and has only released the first episode of an eventual 3. That's the 1/3 part I mentioned earlier. It's the 2023 equivalent of how games like Doom released a free shareware version in order to hook players and then charge them for the rest of the game, but now you pay first and wait for the full launch to have access to the complete experience. The old way was unarguably better for players, but shareware marketing hasn't been a viable business model since people stopped mailing floppy disks to each other, and the only thing preventing players from waiting until the game is finished now is FOMO. Fortunately, the first episode of Wizordum is exceptionally fun. Hexen was unique in the fact that it let players choose at the start of their adventure whether they would play as a mage, a cleric, or a fighter, and each of these 3 characters has had their own stats and weapons not available to the other 2. This was a neat idea, but in practice it could be frustrating. The mage was the only character who started off with a ranged weapon, for instance, but it was incredibly weak. The cleric had the coolest ultimate weapon. It was a staff that summoned deadly ghosts that swarmed enemies and could shoot fire from his hands, but he can never put out as much damage as the relatively lame-looking fighter. Wizordum fixes this by doing away with the ideas of multiple characters and giving the player a grab bag of the best weapons and magical abilities Hexen had to offer, along with a few new ones. The main melee weapon, a mace not dissimilar to Hexen's cleric starting weapon, has the added bonus of being able to be charged with mana just like Timon's axe, a feature which makes it useful not just as a last resort, but as a viable option in regular combat. The next 2 weapons players will come across, Fire Rings and the magic wand that shoots ice, are both also improvements on Hexen's Firestorm and Sapphire wand, respectively. I've found that using Wizordum's Ice Wand to freeze enemies and then switching to the mace to smash them to bits to be a great way of conserving ammo. The core gameplay loop of Wizordum should be familiar to anyone who played 2.5D shooters in the 1990s. Players move through levels at a higher than average speed while flipping switches, pulling chains, and just generally finding different variations of keys to open different variations of locks, while being attacked by rats, ogres, cultists, and a wide range of other monsters. Sometimes these keys or switches need to be shot, and sometimes they need to be grabbed. Walls may or may not contain secret areas if you push them. There's not any attempted over-the-top wheel reinvention going on here, nor should there be. Wizordum is Hexen refined and condensed to its core elements, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the game's lack of a jump button. The worst part about Hexen, and to be fair, most FPS games of the late 90s and early 2000s, especially Half-Life, are horrible platforming sections which littered the levels. It wasn't just that the platforming sections were difficult in Hexen, which they were, but often failure to land perfectly meant an instant death, which would necessitate either saving the game before each jumping section or replaying a large chunk of the level over again. Wizordum has no jumping, and it's a better game for it. The 8 levels available in the early access release of Wizordum can be finished somewhat quickly, depending on the player's skill level and how much they care about finding 100% of all the secret areas and hidden treasures scattered throughout. That might not sound like enough content to justify a release at this time, but considering the asking price of $14.99 and the promise of more episodes in the future, it feels like a fair amount. And that's before discussing what is absolutely my favorite part of Wizordum and the reason why I haven't really played much else in the past week: the level editor. Level editors are the best thing FPS game developers can give their players. From playing around with the build engine to modding Half-Life, from Timesplitter's Mapmaker to Doom 2016's custom multiplayer levels, allowing players to access development tools and letting them see what they can create themselves has long been a feature worth championing. The level editor in Wizordum is fantastic, and allows for some truly massive and intricate designs. There are still some issues that are being worked out, and patches are coming even during this period of review that are making things better. While I was playing, a patch came out that said, now placing an empty creaturizer object in the level editor won't crash the level anymore. I didn't know that was the problem. I'm glad that's fixed. Also this one. To be completely fair, Wizordum's most recent patch at the time of writing also includes the note, frozen enemies will shatter into ice gibs in cubes, so overall it's a net win for players all around. This game loves its gibs and isn't afraid to show it. There's even a gore slider if you want to make it look as close to brutal Doom as possible. Like I said, it's early access. These types of patches and fixes are to be expected, and it speaks to the quality of the team at Emberheart Games that multiple fixes and patches have come so quickly after Wizordum's launch. All the available evidence shows the company plans to continue updating and improving the game throughout the early access period, and personally I can't wait to see how the final product ends up. Even if it was just this, though, for $14.99 and the promise of endless amount of community-made levels that will likely get even weirder and more intricate than anything I could come up with, Wizordum is worth it. At least for people like me who still prefer games like Graven and Ion Fury over whatever Call of Duty we're on now. Wizordum is available now on PC via Steam Early Access. A Steam code was provided to Screen Rant for the purposes of this review.